Welcome back everyone to another video on the Vixen Victory channel. Today we're going to be talking about Kachina, looking at everything that she has to offer for a lot of different characters, but also looking forward into our character archive. We've already talked about the first few characters as well as the other characters that are on the banners, and now we've made our way to Kachina. So let's go ahead and talk about her as a character. Now the great thing about Kachina that you need to kind of keep in mind is that she's going to do a lot of off-field geo-specific application. Now it's not going to be an insane amount, but it is going to be a pretty good amount where a lot of teams that like crystallize, especially characters like Navia, who the major person I'm going to be using specifically my Kachina with. There's a lot of other characters, obviously your main geo teams. But because of her artifact set that she has, she can make a lot of good use out of even giving elemental damage bonus to even other teams that may not want a Geo character normally in their team because they kind of just don't need it. But because of this, it almost acts like a wannabe Viridescent and allows her to be put in a few different teams, especially kind of combining her with the core 4 that she's with. So that being stated, there's a lot of help that she can do. But let's go ahead and talk about her talents and her talent priority first. Now looking at here, you can already see I've even gone and shown already that you can go into the skill and the burst, and these are the only real two things I would ever really level into. For normal attack, if you want to, because you have extras, go right ahead and do so. Personally, for me, I would wait until some other future Natlan characters just so that you can keep even some of these resources a little bit. I know it's very cheap, especially to get it to a lower level like 4 or even 6 sometimes, but I do feel like just not even touching it until you wait until you get most of the characters you want from the nation would be my personal preference. That's at least what I'm doing. But at the end of the day, though, it still comes down to the skill and the burst being the highest things that you're going to level into, mainly looking at a lot of damage. Now, once again, she's an off-field character, but she can put out some good damage, and once again, mainly focusing into that geo application from off-field. So, looking at her skill, though, you can already see in the talents, everything is based off of defense percent as well. So going into a high amount of defense is going to change how we look at weapons as well as artifacts, the actual stats and what we look at there. And just because I do want to bring it up as well, looking at the burst, it does have a 70 energy cost. Usually with the teams you're going to be running her in, you'll probably be running her with other characters that have a high ER, or they'll be running some sort of double geo or even a full mono geo team. So possibly the idea with her needing too much energy recharge isn't a crazy amount, but I would say that it is something that you want to kind of keep in mind depending on what you actually want to do with her. Now, if you, once again, the teams that I'm running, I don't really need a lot of ER from her, so she went for a lower ER for me, but I just wanted to keep that in mind before we actually look at the talent info. Speaking of the talent info, let's go ahead and talk about her skill. Her skill will basically summon a Turbo Twirly, which will then basically throw out this little riding thing that she does. You can throw out a little geo application, and every so often it's going to do some geo hits, and as you see on the counter on the left hand side, she's going to be losing Night Soul points every single time that this is going to smash into the ground. And as soon as it's done with Night Soul, then it will be done and it will obviously come off the field. So that's how basically it kind of works with her skill, at least initially when you throw it out on the field. You can use this in a hold version, and at that point, Kachina will then summon the Turbo Twirly, but then ride it as well. And then you can manually do basically normal attacks with the skill to jump up and down. But when you do so, you can move around a lot, it does increase your speed, and you can even ride up on walls and whatnot. But keep in mind that this is using your Night Soul as well, and will start using your Phlogiston as well. Now, keep in mind that as you do spam normal attacks, you are losing Phlogiston as well as Night Soul points as well. And then when you are fully out of Phlogiston, when you're riding it, you'll use Phlogiston as well as your Night Soul, which you can only use in Natlan. But when you are doing that, you are going to be losing that bit. But as you do those normal attacks, as you saw, you'll be losing your Night Soul points as well with each of the attacks. Now, it does allow you to hit them more consistently and fast. But once again, because I'm out of Night Soul and out of Phlogiston, then it will be going away. So if you really want her to be a little bit more on field or use her for personal damage or grab some particles with her as a character, you can throw her on field as well using that method by just basically holding the skill down and using it that way by using those normal attacks. She gains the 60 Night Soul basically. And then looking further a little bit more, Turbo Twirly can exist independently or be ridden upon, which we already talked about. And you can mount and dismount them as well, which can be nice if you kind of jump on or accidentally get on. It's not like you're stuck immediately on it, you can jump off. But you already saw how it is dealing all that defense, that damage based off of the defense, and the normal attacks you do are considered going into defense as well. So all the damage you're going to be doing is based off of defense, whether that be the mounted damage when you're actually on it. That does do more damage, so if you are looking for Kachina to output higher damage input, then you would want to actually mount the Turbo Twirly, whereas if you just throw it off field, if you're just trying to get particles or whatnot, or just have extra application for Crystallize or something like that, or for the 4-piece that you're trying to trigger as well, then you would just put it off field. It does do less damage, but it still does do a pretty good amount of damage as well, once again mainly focusing though in the application aspect. Turbo Twirly will disappear once Kachina's Night Soul Blessing state ends, which is basically when she runs out of Night Soul points, and it is considered a Geo construct. So if there are other characters that are, get extra buffs based off of the Geo constructs, for instance, a character like Chiori, if you have a Geo construct already on the field, then Chiori will gain 2 of her little dolls at the same time instead of the 1. So that is kind of nice to know and have if you don't have one of the constellations. So it is kind of good to have if you do have other Geo characters, specifically also because, Chiori is another character that kind of likes to have other characters with Geo constructs, and, obviously this kind of allows Kachina to be put in that place as well if need be. Only one Turbo Twirly can be created at one time for Kachina, so only one of those can be out on field, which should be pretty, obviously kind of the major idea anyways. But looking at the burst next, this is once again the second thing you're going to level into. Now looking at the burst though, it states that it's striking the ground, Kachina deals AoE Geo damage based on her defense and creates a Turbo Drill field. The field increases Turbo Twirly's attack AoE and its movement speed when Kachina is riding it. If Kachina's own Turbo Twirly is present when this is used, the Turbo Twirly will be summoned to her side. If you're going to be using your burst, you're going to do a big damage hit at the beginning, which is nice, especially because once again it is based off defense, so there's your big damage hit. And as you get here, you can see how this is a little bit faster. As you saw, it increased the attack AoE, or the actual kind of distance that it hit, so you can hit more enemies at one time, and it does increase her movement speed as well, so that is something nice to keep in mind as well. But overall, looking past her skill and her burst, that's basically how they work. So let's go ahead and look at some passives. Her first passive talent states that after a nearby character triggers a Night Soul Burst, basically any type of Natlan character that uses elemental damage, that's triggering a Night Soul Burst. It does have a cooldown, depending on, the consistency or the amount of characters from Natlan you have in the team. But basically, once you do that, Kachina's Geo damage bonus will be increased by 20% for 12 seconds. Now, that does mean that even still, if you are using an on-field character like one of the more recent characters and one of the characters we just talked about, Mualani, if you use her and you're using her on field, Mualani loves to be on field, as well as obviously the DPSs do. Having Kachina's skill off field still does give her that damage. So if Kachina is having her skill off field and Mualani hits something with her Sharky's Bite or something like that, any of that elemental damage, anything that she hits with Hydro, then that will allow Kachina to get this Geo damage bonus, which will still increase her damage from off field because it is increasing obviously her overall stat. Looking at the second passive talent, it states that Turbo Twirly's damage is increased by 20% of Kachina's defense. So never mind is it based off of defense in the normal damage, but the second passive just increases it a little bit more. So looking a little bit further beyond these kind of talents, basically you want to focus into your skill and your burst. You don't necessarily have to go into the burst. I personally do, just because I like to see the higher damage number, and it's not that terrible really with a 4-star character to go into the burst as well. But also mainly it's increasing the attack AoE, allowing you to hit more things at once with your Turbo Twirly. So it is more of a personal kind of burst here. It's not really helping out too many people. Now let's go ahead and talk about weapons. Now when we talk about weapons, you want to keep in mind that with her, going into defense is going to be your best bet. She already ascends into something like Geo damage bonus, so going into defense is kind of not necessary, but it is more of a desired go for than some of the other options. But if you are having trouble with getting her burst back and you really do like her burst, for instance, I don't really use her burst that often because I don't use the mounted version as much, so I keep a very low energy recharge and I go full blown into personal damage and defense percent. But if you are kind of a little bit more on the idea that you like to use her as a quick swap, you like to have her out on field a little bit more, once again using the burst to increase her AoE, which is obviously technically increasing her damage because she can hit more enemies. And then if you're basically doing that to use her burst and you want her burst back more consistently, then I would go ahead and obviously something like Engulfing Lightning with an energy recharge main stat. This is more or less for the main stat. Remember, her damage is still based off of her defense percent. So the attack increase isn't too crazy, but it is nice. And after using the burst, you'll get some extra energy recharge as well. So if you are going for a full-blown kind of higher amount of ER as a character, technically Engulfing Lightning can work. Do I think that it's a good idea to pull your Engulfing Lightning off of your Raiden to put it on your Kachina? No. Which is why actually the other weapon I would probably tell you to use it before that would be Favonius Lance. Favonius Lance gives 30.6% energy recharge at level 90. But it does state that you can create more particles. Now that's not only for Kachina, but it can be for other characters in the team as well. If you're creating those white particles, it can allow for other characters to do so. Which means that, making sure you have a good amount of crit, or somewhat of a good amount of crit. She is obviously hitting in, by herself, independently, off field, while the other characters are doing their damage, which means that this possibly can help. If she can crit with one of those hits, or one of the hits when she's mounted on Turbo Twirly, then that can help as well. Basically just creating more particles for herself or the team, kind of depends on who grabs the particles when you switch over to them. But once again, I do think that something like Footprint of the Rainbow, in my personal opinion, especially if you want a weapon that's a little bit more focused on personal damage, and you can technically make up your ER needs on the substats or main stats on your artifacts, which we're going to talk about in a second. So something like Footprint of the Rainbow can do extremely well, I do think, just because of, once again, the defense percent main stat. Now at level 90, and I only have this at level 80, but at level 90 you get 51.7% of defense at level 90, so you're getting about 4% more, which is why I kind of just kept it at level 80, especially for my 4-star characters. But using an elemental skill in the passive, you'll increase your defense by 16% for 15 seconds. Now when you use your skill, obviously, you're going to have your Turbo Twirly out, whether it's the hold or the press version. As you saw with some of the damage hits that I did, it's a little bit more and it can, last a little bit of time, especially when it's independent and you're not using it to just slam into the ground consistently. But once again, that is increasing your personal damage. So something like Footprint of the Rainbow for me is a pretty good weapon, and I do like. If I had to put them in order, I think that Favonius Lance and Footprint of the Rainbow are at the top, depending which way you want to go. If you want more ER for getting that burst back consistently, to have her, if you like to go the mounted way on Turbo Twirly with Kachina, then ER is probably the better way to go. If you're more like me, where you just kind of only use it as application or off-field personal damage, then I think something like Footprint of the Rainbow is just going to be better, personally, for me. Now, looking a little bit further though, let's go ahead and talk about energy recharge and defense and all that other stuff. When we look at a character like Kachina, her best set, I think without a doubt, and especially if I look at the loading data here, we can see that most people are going to be using Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City, as you can see I run with here. You can see in the 2-piece here, it states that when a nearby party member triggers a Night Soul Burst, the equipping character regenerates 6 elemental energy. Now, obviously in the teams that I'm running, I'm not making too much use of this personal passive or the 2-piece in the set, but if you are going to be using her with a character like Mualani or even someone like Kanish, which you wouldn't really get too much of a buff by using it with Kanish with obviously the 4-piece, but technically Kanish could still trigger this. Any of those Natlan characters as well as future Natlan characters that do elemental damage, then that will trigger her to get some extra elemental energy. So that's just something to keep in mind. It will allow her also, if you're going to be using her on that also can keep you in mind to be like, okay, well maybe I don't need the extra elemental energy. Maybe I don't need the ER because I can get at least some from this 2-piece of Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City. Now, if we look a little bit further at the 4-piece, it states that after the equipping character triggers a reaction related to the elemental type, which means any reaction that can be created with Geo, which is crystallized with any of the core 4, Hydro, Cryo, Pyro, or Electro, all nearby party members gain a 12% elemental damage bonus for the elemental types involved in the elemental reaction for 15 seconds, which means both Geo and the reaction it creates crystallized with, so once again any of those core 4, both of those will get a 12% elemental damage bonus for everyone. But if the equipping character is in the Night Soul Blessing state, which when you use your skill, which I would say that if you're going to do this, I would obviously use your skill to create those crystallized, just because that's going to allow you to get this extra buff as well. When you're in the Night Soul Blessing state basically, and you trigger that same effect, you trigger crystallize, all nearby party members gain an additional 28% elemental damage bonus for both of the elemental types created in the part, basically in that reaction, which means if Farina was out here, right, and she did Hydro on an enemy, now it's effective with Hydro. Kachina, I switch over to Kachina, throw out my skill, and switch off. It creates Crystallize, the Hydro and the Geo creates Crystallize. Both elements are part of that reaction now. Now, because I just used my skill to obviously put on that application, I was in my Knight's Hope Blessing state, which means that I get the 12% from the initial damage, elemental damage bonus, which you don't have to be in the Knight's Hope Blessing to do. But I also get the 28% on top of that. And that's 40% elemental damage bonus for Geo, as well as for Hydro, which means now Farina can do more personal damage as well, which she's a character that likes to do that as well. So if the character that you're trying to buff that with can be an off-field character that is a little bit different, that can be helpful for them, but it also means that it can help other characters that are on-field that have, once again, part of the core 4, it can give them a 40% elemental damage bonus. Now, depending on, do you like this or do you have another character that could do better than that? Obviously, I'm not going to state that Kachina can just basically be used in place of someone like Kazuha or someone, a little bit different that uses Viridescent like Jean, or even someone like we have Shan Yun here. Basically, I do want to state, though, that it can be helpful, especially on other sides of the Abyss or really fun teams in Imaginarium Theater. You are helping, once again, that other character you created with. So Pyro characters, Hydro characters, Cryo characters, and Electro characters, if they are basically creating a crystallized reaction with Kachina, they are getting this buff here, which I think is extremely good. Now, let's go ahead and talk about stats. In general, when we look at these stats, I do want to state that with the Sands, a lot of people are going to be doing defense percent. Now, you do see that some people are doing energy recharge, which I will say, once again, this is where if you have a defense percent weapon like Footprint of the Rainbow with me, and you're like, okay, I have that, but I really still like to kind of put her on field and use her more mounted on the Turbo Twirly, then that's kind of something I would rather do. Then this would probably be better to go for an ER Sands here. Now it also just depends on what you have for stats. So personally, I do like the defense percent in my personal opinion, but if you have an ER Sands with a lot of defense on it, go ahead and go for it. That can be extremely helpful for you as well. It just might be a little bit better for you depending on what you want to do. For the Goblet, same thing, defense percent. Obviously, this one has been extremely helpful for me because it has a bunch of ER. This is probably what you would want the most out of, a defense percent Goblet with a bunch of ER on it. Now, when we look at a Circlet, I know that because one of the weapons I talked about was Favonius Lance, technically a crit rate Circlet could be extremely helpful for you. So if you have a lot of crit rate, that's going to help you crit more, which can allow you to trigger the passive on the weapon, which is giving more particles to you or to other characters. So I do want to state, or to Kachina or other characters, so I do want to state that you can run a crit rate Circlet, but in my personal opinion, I think triple defense is the way to go. And as you can see here, crit rate is the major thing that most people use. Once again, probably because most people use Favonius Lance. Also, it does help with personal damage. It allows her to crit more often, which means that she's technically also putting out more damage because she's critting. So you're still getting an extra amount of damage. Even if you don't have a high amount of crit damage, it is still kind of somewhat helpful to have like that extra bit of damage through and through with her as a character. So yes, it is helping a passive, but it also is helping her do more damage. Personally, though, the way I just felt to just kind of go about her was triple defense. The more accepted way to go with Favonius Lance is defense percent, and a crit rate Circlet. And then the other way to go, if you are running a defense percent Circlet and you're not running Favonius Lance, it's probably either an ER Sands or a defense percent Sands with defense percent and defense percent on the Goblet and Circlet. Once again, as you kind of saw, with the pieces that are not defense percent, you're going for a lot of defense percent on the substats for, once again, things that don't have defense percent on the main stats. But if you are, you have defense percent on the main stat here, going for something that has some ER is going to be your best bet for substats. So defense percent and ER are the only substats you really care about. If you have Fav Lance, technically, you could also go for some crit rate where you can find it. That wouldn't necessarily be terrible. So depending on what you have and what you use, that can be helpful for you. Now let's go a little bit further and look beyond this and look at Constellations. Now with 4 stars, you don't really want Constellations. They just kind of come to you. So with the first Constellation, it states that when Kachina mounts or dismounts Turbo Twirly, she will absorb nearby elemental shards created by Crystallize. Additionally, which also might help some other characters that go off Crystallize, but additionally when a party member picks up such a shard, 3 energy will be restored to Kachina. Energy can be restored this way one time every 5 seconds. So once again, the kind of team that I'm running right now, as soon as I get to C1, I think I'm going to have a little bit more fun. It will also allow me to not have to worry about ER. This is also another reason why if you get to C1, you have this way, as well as if you're running with a character that is, on field a little bit more. That is a Natlan character, once again, one of the core 4, character like Mualani. If you have the C1 and you're running, Kachina with Mualani, I think that the 3 energy you can get from here, as well as the other thing that you can get from one of the 2 pieces from the Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City, this is going to be pretty helpful. The 6 elemental energy you can get from the Night Soul Burst hit, from that, obviously from Mualani doing a hit, but when you get that Constellation, that's also adding another 3 every 5 seconds, so you can start to stack up a lot of energy, and you don't really have to worry too much about energy really too much. But I still do think that obviously the people who run energy, that's perfectly fine, and it does extremely well. Personally, for me, I'm just not really caring too much about using the burst. But the C2 states that a little bit further, when the Kachina uses Time to Get Serious, she will regain 20 Night Soul points, which is her burst. If there is no Turbo Twirly belonging to her on the field, she will enter Night Soul Blessing state and then summon one of the Turbo Twirlies instead as well. Which means that when you use your skill, this is probably the way to go. You want to use your skill and then do a few hits, and then immediately, once you get to about half to 2/3 of your kind of bar on the left hand side of Kachina, probably use your burst at that point. That'll throw out Turbo Twirly again, obviously increase your AoE, allowing hopefully more damage if there's multiple enemies nearby, and you'll also get more Night Soul points as well, which means that you can stay in the Turbo Twirly Night Soul Blessing state a little bit longer and do more damage, as well as obviously because more Night Soul, you're doing more damage because you're in it longer. Everything kind of goes on a little bit further from there. Now the C3 states it increases the level of her skill by 3, and the C5 increases the level of her burst by 3. The C4 states that when there are 1, 2, 3, 4, or more opponents within the turbo drill field created by her burst, the active character within the field gains 8, 12, 16, and 20% increased defense. Now the great thing about this is mainly for if you're once again caring a lot about Kachina, once again, as you start to get more constellations, this is a lot of personal damage. So I do think that the idea with her here is a little bit more focused on her, and that means also technically that you could switch to another character that goes off defense. So a character like Noelle or a character like Ito. Switch over to them and they will get this buff as well, but usually you'll be using this with Kachina just because of obviously the buff that she already gives herself by increasing her AoE for her Turbo Twirly. Either way, it'll either help her or a defense scaling character. Looking at the C6, it says when your active character's shield is replaced or destroyed for any type of reason, Kachina will deal 200% of her defense as AoE Geo defense, and this effect can be triggered once every 5 seconds. So characters with shields obviously are going to work pretty well with a C6 Kachina as well, doing a lot of personal damage. I do think that overall with a lot of these constellations, you get to see a lot of personal damage coming out of Kachina, and I think it is really, really cool to see, especially because at C0, she does okay damage, but as you start to get more and more constellations, the more you start to see a lot of damage that she can output. Overall, obviously, just because this isn't a 5-star character and 4-star constellations just kind of come and go, I'm not really going to go into which one should you really go after, because especially with a character that was free like her, getting more constellations over time is going to be helpful either way, obviously with her, but obviously 5-star characters is a little bit different because you actually have to go usually pretty heavy into it and make a decision to do so, whereas 4 stars you can kind of pick them up along the way and they're really not necessary too much usually for the characters. So let's go ahead and look a little bit further at her teams. So overall, with the teams that you're going to be using, as you can see, the team I'm already using is going to be the Navia kind of crystallized team. Now, the thing to keep in mind with this is if you have someone like Xilonen, use Xilonen 10 times out of 10 over Kachina. I know this is a Kachina video, but if you have Xilonen, just use her there. Now, at the same time, if you are running Navia and you realize that Navia and Farina are just really, really strong, but you really want to use Kachina or Xilonen on the other side of something. For instance, if you're looking at someone like if I was running in the Abyss or something like that, and I had Arle on the other side of the Abyss, and I had Navia and you have Farina already on this other side, you might want to put maybe Kazuha and Xilonen and Bennett. That's one of the teams I use for Arle, just a pure pyro team. Then I might just do this, and then I could either keep Bennett here or put him over here, but it does allow Kachina to play that role that Xilonen somewhat plays as well, being the other Geo character for the double Geo resonance that you get here, which is extremely good in my personal opinion for this type of team. Obviously having the double Geo, even though Navia gets more out of having, you know, more crystallized kind of happen because it's helping her get more personal, obviously increasing her charges, which is then allowing her to do higher damage. It still is nice to see though that Kachina technically can allow this to happen, but the two kind of Geo characters is extremely strong because you're decreasing Geo resistance of enemies and you're increasing damage dealt as well when you have a shield on you. Obviously with the amount of crystallizes you put on you, having that is going to be pretty easy in my personal opinion. Now, also with this type of team, you could also switch to a totally different team, which is a mono Geo team. So if you had 4 Geo characters, or at least 3 of them with like a Bennett or something like that, or another random character, that could be helpful as well. So if you're running, let's say Ito, Kachina, Goro, and Shilonen, that could also technically work. Keep in mind that their 4-piece isn't really going to be helpful at all because it is mono Geo, because once again, you're not creating any reactions. So unless you're going against something that already has an element applied to it, they won't be able to trigger the 4-piece from Scroll the Hero of Sindoh City. But if you are going against something like the Hydro Tulpa with, you know, an Ito, you know, mono Geo team, Shilonen and Kachina mainly here can also trigger that 4-piece because once again, if it has Hydro on it and then Kachina is doing her skill or whatever on it, you're creating that reaction, and both Hydro and Geo to the party are given that elemental damage bonus. So once again, with the mono Geo team, the 4-piece can fall off. So I do want to state that as well, but it also does mean that if you do know what you're fighting against, it can be helpful as well. Really, with most of her other teams, I would really say that that's kind of it. Usually the crystallized team is the way to go. Yes, you can run her with some random other characters, Risley, or once again, any of the core 4, Raiden, Ayaka, Neuvillette even, if you want to, you know, kind of help him a little bit out more. Once again, as she's throwing out her Turbo Twirly and her Knights of Blessing state, and she creates a Geo reaction with obviously Crystallize with any of the core 4, Hu Tao or something like that. If she's creating that reaction, creating Crystallize, both Geo, so she's getting a personal damage buff with the elemental damage bonus, but also the character that created the element that created the reaction with her is also getting the damage buff. So if you put her in terms of a different team like this, technically, if you swapped out Kazuha or if you swapped out Shilonen here, technically you could also allow her to do a little bit more here as well. So I do think that overall with this type of team, it can work. Obviously, Kachina is helping not only Neuvillette, but also Farina. And if you could still technically throw in a character like Shilonen instead of Kazuha here, just to have this a little bit more. That might help if you don't have a C1 Neuvillette. That can help him. If you're creating Crystallize and picking up the Crystallized shields, putting a shield on him so that you can decrease the Geo resistance of the enemies to maybe help, you know, Kachina do more damage. But you're also putting a shield up on Neuvillette technically, which is allowing him in without his C0, increasing his interruption to resistance because they'll be hitting the shield instead of him. So that is still pretty good, I would say, overall. But I do think it heavily depends on what characters you use. So kind of be mindful in the teams that you are using, you know, Kachina with. It can work on a plethora of teams. Once again, those core 4 teams, Diluc, Hu Tao, obviously Neuvillette here, Ayaka, probably not too much Eula, but a character like Raiden. It can work on Eula, but it's not going to work very well. Risley, Yoimiya, Arlecchino. You have so many characters that are just going to be, once again, part of the core 4 that can work with Kachina because of the 4-piece that she creates. Also, if she's running Favonius Lance, it's even more of a help to the team because it's just another character that can create energy for herself and the party. Also, once again, if you do like to have that mounted version, it can be more personal damage as your DPSs kind of recharge and stay off field, wait for cooldowns to be done. If your characters have high cooldowns, Kachina could be with her burst and then getting on field, could allow a little bit more time as you're getting in a rotation to be a little bit more helpful for those characters to do a little bit more time off field so they can get ready for the next rotation. But overall, I think those are the kinds of teams you would really run her with. In my personal opinion, I think that she works best in a Navia kind of crystallized team. Some of the other teams can work as well. Some type of, you know, her running with, back up to that, I think that her running with not even other Geo characters, but just one of the core 4 type of characters, she can be used in place of a Viridescent. So if Kazuha or Sucrose or Jean is the only Viridescent user on your account, or Venti or something like that, then Kachina can be on the other side or be used in the Imaginarium Theater on a different team to kind of give them an extra buff when she creates a reaction, once again with that core 4, just like Viridescent would do with your Animo characters, considering they are only with the core 4 as well. Technically, once again, Kachina thirdly can work with those mono Geo teams. They just have to be going up against something that has an element already applied to them so that they can actually get the buff. But that also does mean with those Geo teams, usually like Zhongli or something like that, can create a very, very strong shield, which is making the 2 kind of character elemental resonance here actually work better than it would on some other teams, especially in the crystallized team as well.
One with wind and cloud. Wind strike.
Drilling down! Let her rip!
Transfix.
Illusion shattered. I'm fine. I'm going in.
Storm the front. Torn to oblivion. Shine down. Illusion shattered.
Everybody stand! Drilling down! Here goes!
Quiver. Now you shall perish. Ha.
Yeah! Let her rip! I'm going in!
No turning back. Shine down. Ha, ha. Inazuma shines eternal. Transcend all constraints.
Teamwork is true!
Flash. Storm the front. Torn to oblivion.
Well, that's everything I've got talking about Kachina. If you guys did enjoy the video, please go ahead and like and subscribe. Let me know how you guys built your Kachina as well. This is kind of the team that I mainly would ever run her with. Sadly, because of Shilonen kind of coming in place, you know, Kachina has taken a back turn on a lot of my teams. But whenever it comes to the Imaginarium Theater, she is a very prominent and good figure to kind of use once again being used as kind of that extra quote-unquote viridescent user. Now that you have the scroll set, a character like her can be extremely helpful for a lot of teams, once again for that core 4, which is the same thing that you use for the viridescent set. So I do think that that 4-piece with Kachina does allow her to be very and extremely useful in something like the Imaginarium Theater. But if you don't have Shilonen, she's going to be your probably #1 character to use that set, usually for most of the other characters. Thank you again for watching the video though, guys, and I'll see you guys in the next one.